The mention of the Vikings probably brings to mind big, hairy men sailing around in ships with dragons on the prow, raiding, looting, burning, and of course, raping everything in sight, while wearing helmets with big horns sticking out of them. Ah! There's a building over there! Burn it! There's a church over there! Loot it! Ah, there's a woman! Rape her! Ah! Yeah, well, like many things in popular imagination, that isn't quite the way it was. No. Yes, they did do those things, apart from the horns. They never wore horned helmets. That's straight out of a Richard Wagner opera. But they did do a lot of other things too, like farming, fishing, exploring, trading, colonizing, having consensual sex, as well as raping people. And surprisingly, perhaps, building forts. Now, I would doubt that many people would think of the Vikings as architects and builders of fortifications. Attacking other people's fortifications, perhaps, yes, but not building their own. But they did. And some of them were quite massive, equal in size to most of the great medieval castles and far larger than some. So welcome to another of Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. And in this video, I'll be looking at, Viking forts. Or rather, mostly at Danish forts. There's a difference between a Viking fort and a Danish fort. The two are not quite the same thing, which I'll come to in a moment. Now, the most numerous of Viking fortifications were the Longfort, or long ports, which were constructed on the banks of rivers and could serve as temporary bases of operation during raids. Defensible places where ships could be safely berthed and maintained while still having a quick access back to the water. Now, some of these long ports became permanent, being used so that raiding parties could winter in foreign lands rather than having to return to their home bases, be it in Scandinavia or the Orkneys and Shetland Islands or wherever. And not a few of these would grow and eventually become towns and cities. Dublin, Cork and Waterford, for example, in Ireland, began that way, among others, starting off as little more than rest stops for Viking raiders and growing into the major cities of this country. Now, a typical long port would be more or less D-shaped, usually comprising an earthen bank with a wooden palisade on top and often a ditch as well, forming the curve of the D, while the straight part would be the river itself. A fine example of a long port was discovered at the village of Repton, lying on an arm of the River Trent in Derbyshire, England, a fortification that had served as the base of what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called the Hafenheere, or the Heathen Army, during the winter of 873 to 874 AD. The Great Heathen Army, as it's become known, was the largest Viking force ever to land in England, arriving in 865 AD and staying for 14 years, comprising mostly Danes, but with sizable contingents of Norwegians and possibly a few Swedes thrown in as well, initially led by the famous Ivar Ragnarsson, better known as Ivar in Bainlausi or Ivar the Boneless, as well as his brothers Uber and Halfdan. Ivar himself had returned to Dublin, however, before the construction of the Repton Longport, so he can take no credit for it. The Longport at Repton was defended by a more or less D-shaped rampart, comprising an earthen bank with a wooden palisade on top and a V-shaped ditch 12 feet wide and 12 feet deep as well, that forming the curve of the D, while the straight part was formed by the River Trent itself. And the fort cleverly incorporated a Christian church into its defences, unlikely as that might seem, that being the Royal Shrine of St. Wigston, now known as St. Wigston's Church, the building lying lengthways, almost at the centre of and in the earthen rampart forming the D. And it's thought that its doors provided an easily defended access into the enclosure, a sort of ready-made gatehouse, if you like. A fine example of utilising local features to assist with the construction. And not only did the church provide a strong gateway feature, incorporating it into the outer defences as they had, but it saved having to build quite a considerable length of rampart as well. There were also structures outside the defensive rampart, though that fact came as quite a surprise to archaeologists. The camp has been excavated starting back in the 1970s, and it's one of the few long ports to be discovered. And as the work spread out beyond the rampart, it was discovered that the site was considerably larger than anyone had thought. At one time, it was believed that the camp had been entirely within the defensive rampart, which would seem logical, but archaeologists from Bristol University found that extensive structures existed well out beyond the rampart, including ship repair yards and metalworking sites. They found special road nails used in the construction of ships, battle axes, arrows, and hundreds of gaming pieces made out of lead, which shows what the army was doing to pass the time, as well as a mass grave containing over 260 bodies. The Repton camp is a very considerable site in Viking history. Prior to Repton, however, the Great Army had constructed a considerably larger structure, a torxie on the River Trent in the minor kingdom of Lindsey in present-day Lincolnshire, which has been excavated recently. It was found to have been quite enormous, larger than most of the cities of the day, covering an area of over 130 acres. And there was ample evidence of the presence of women and children and of metalworking and other day-to-day activities, as was the case at Repton. A set of iron tools that would have been used by a blacksmith were found, as were pieces of silver that indicated that ornamental items, such as jewellery, were being manufactured, as well as military-related ones. So this was a massive encampment, though it lacked the defences that had featured at Repton, not having the rampart and ditch design, but relying more on natural features provided by its location. So it was more of a fortified encampment than an actual fort. But its size shows that the Great Heathen Army was a very considerable force. Scholars have been divided for years over the actual strength of the Viking force, but the torxie encampment is clear proof that the army was a very large one, since it covered an area greater than the average large city, which speaks for itself. But the longports and similar fortifications, very useful and often brilliantly constructed like the Repton and torxie examples, were still very basic in design. Usually a single rampart and a ditch with some kind of wooden palisade. The ancient Britons had built similar forts long before the Roman conquest, as had the Celts of Ireland. What was a new feature about the Longport, however, was its purpose as a base for raiding operations and a safe haven for ships, always situated on a riverbank with one side open to the river for ease of access. Other forts might well have been in similar locations on the bank of a river, but not purposefully designed for the protection and maintenance of shipping. Clever and highly useful though the longports were, the real crowning glory of Viking fort design is found back home in Scandinavia, principally in Denmark. Strictly speaking, though, they are not Viking forts. They are Danish forts, since a Dane only became a Viking when he, or sometimes she, got into a ship and went somewhere. The same went for Norwegians or Swedes, since the word Viking or Vikinger in Old Norse wasn't a term of nationality. It simply meant one who went abroad, raiding or exploring or whatever else they might be doing. It was like kind of being a pirate, if you like. As long as they stayed at home and had nothing to do with ships, they weren't Vikings, since to be a Viking required a ship and somewhere to go in the ship. It's rather like saying, if you drive a truck, you are not a truck. You are a truck driver. That's an important point. A Scandinavian couldn't be a Viking, but they could go Viking. Given that, while the longports in Britain or Ireland could be said to be Viking forts, since they were constructed by raiders who had gone Viking, those in Denmark were built by Danes who were not Vikings in the true sense. They didn't have anything to do with getting into ships and going somewhere to do something or other when they got to wherever it was they were going. 3 of these amazing structures, plus a ring wall, lie in a straight line when seen on a map, almost as if they were deliberately aligned, like a ley line. 2 close together towards the northeast, Aggersborg and Freikat in the district of North Denmark, and 2 more similarly close together further to the southwest, the ring wall rather than a full fort at Eskeholm and Trelleborg. Other similar structures are Nonnebraken and Bora. And in 2014, a previously unknown fortress of the same type was discovered by archaeologists led by Dr. Nana Holm at Kurga near Copenhagen. These impressive fortresses are thought to have been constructed circa 980 AD on the orders of King Harald Gormson, better known today as Harald Bluetooth, the first Christian king of Denmark and Norway, who ruled circa 958 to 986 AD, though some may also have been constructed by his son, Sven Haraldsson, nicknamed Sven Forkbeard, and could have served some purpose perhaps in connection with his raids on England, perhaps as training grounds or staging areas, though that is pure conjecture. We really don't know what they were used for. Oddly enough, they had quite a short usage period, no more than 20 years or so, which we will come to in a moment, after which they were abandoned. But the reason for that is uncertain. Obviously, they had served their purpose, whatever that was, but why build these huge structures and then just walk away from them? We should begin with the greatest of the forts, or ring castles, as they've also been called, Aggersborg. Aggersborg, situated near the town of Aggersund on the north side of Limfjord, is typical of the Danish ring fort, though by far the largest, comprising a huge circular earthen rampart 35 feet in thickness, but now only about 10 feet high, though it would have been considerably greater in its day, worn down by erosion over the centuries. The rampart surrounded by a ditch over 4 feet deep, which again would have been considerably deeper since it's been partly filled in over the centuries, and 14 feet wide. Quite a formidable ditch. The entire fort some 800 feet in diameter. That's a big fort. 2 wooden planked roads form a cross that met at the center of the fort, coming from gates at the compass points, north, south, east, west, the gate openings themselves having been tunneled below the rampart, thus keeping its circular structure intact, though that feature has now collapsed. The rampart was constructed by using rows of wooden posts, strengthened by slanted beams, and then filled in with stones and covered with turf and soil, much of it dug out from the ditch or moat, and strengthened with a wooden cladding, long oak planks being laid upright side by side around the outside of the rampart, forming a solid wall, and a wooden palisade would have topped the rampart, thought to have stood some 13 feet in height, a very formidable defensive structure. A wood-lined walkway would have extended right around the rampart, enabling sentries to move easily, and the gateways would have been fortified with heavy oak doors set in a tower-like structure. The fort was a masterpiece of military engineering, the rampart forming a perfect circle when seen from the air, as do all the ring forts, which also share the same construction methods. Though sadly, in the case of Aggersborg, a considerable section of the rampart has been destroyed by modern buildings, which is a great pity. Nothing remains, of course, of the internal buildings since they were wooden, but their foundations have been traced, showing that there were 48 longhouses, each some 106 by 27 feet, able to accommodate a garrison of about 5,000 men, with further longhouses outside, presumably for families and others living near the fort. These longhouses were rather curious in design, with curved sides and a roof that gave the impression of an upturned boat. Perhaps that was the inspiration. The sheer size of Aggersborg, as well as the size of its garrison, surpassed most of the great castles of Europe that would be constructed in the following centuries. It may have been intended to exercise some control over one of the 3 crossing points on the Army Road, situated nearby on Limfjord, though there's no actual proof of that. Now, Freikat, close to the town of Hobro in the north of Jutland, has, unlike Aggersborg, its beautiful ring structure fully intact, though its height is largely due to excavation work carried out in 1950 to 1958 when the ramparts were restored, ploughing over the years and erosion having reduced their height considerably, and the turf was piled back up to restore them to something similar to their former glory. Like Aggersborg, it is a perfect circle with 4 gates on the compass points and 2 wood-paved roadways that intersect at the centre. The fort is 394 feet in diameter. The ramparts are an impressive 42 feet thick and would have been cladded with oak planks and topped with a wooden palisade estimated at some 13 feet high. And there is a pointed bottom ditch to the northwest, some 26 feet wide and 6 feet deep. Strangely, the ditch was not completed to the west and the southwest. Obviously, attackers were supposed to play by the rules and only attack from one direction. Given its position, the fort could have controlled traffic between our house and Aalborg, but again, that's only conjecture. We have no real idea as to why it was placed there. 16 longhouses stood within the fort, each some 93 by 25 feet, of the same upturned boat design as at Aggersborg, and excavations have determined that many of them were storehouses or workshops. To the northwest of the fort, a cemetery was discovered, and rows of post holes seem to suggest that there was a road leading to it, thought to have been built at the same time as the fort. 30 graves were discovered, though there may well have been more than that originally, those of men, women, and children, indicating the domestic side of the fort as well as its military purpose. A number of the graves had the remains of coffins, as well as rather more unusual body containers, like a chest and even a cart. Carts containing bodies have been found in other Scandinavian graves, perhaps as a means of transport for the departed into the next life, or as an indicator of wealth or status. And jewellery, fabrics, and various items of daily life were also recovered. The only weapon, oddly enough, that was discovered was a small axe, possibly a symbolic one due to its size. It wouldn't really have been much use for bashing somebody's head in. Eskehholm, an irregularly shaped ring wall, of which little remains anyway, doesn't really fit the definition of a true ring fort, so we shall pass on to the next one that does, which is Trelleborg, located on the island of Zealand. The first of this type of fort to be discovered, and it was excavated from 1934 to 1942, and so has given its name to all fortifications that are circular in shape, with their gates and internal roads aligned with the four cardinal points, and collectively known as Trelleborgs. It has been suggested that the name means fortress built by slaves, from the Old Norse thrall, meaning a slave. But perhaps a more likely origin is the word trell, meaning a wooden stave, since the fort's ramparts were partly wooden and lined with wooden cladding, so perhaps the name should really be fortress built of wood. You know, I do rather wonder how anything as massive as this fort had to wait until the 1930s to be discovered, when it would have been perfectly obvious to anyone who went near it, and people in the locality would have, well, they'd have known about it for centuries. The same could be said for the other obvious forts with their ramparts still above ground. How do you discover something that people have been walking over and walking around for hundreds of years? It's big things. Well, it's not up to me to question these things. The fort was connected by a lake to the strait known as the Great Belt, and may have been intended to dominate this important waterway, which it could have done quite easily. Scientific dating of the wood shows that the trees were felled in the autumn of 980 AD, and thus probably used to construct the fort in the spring of 981. And that's a remarkable bit of science in itself. Given the lack of any sign of maintenance or repairs, the fort seems to have been used for hardly more than something like 10 to 15 years. And as I've said, we have no real idea why these forts were abandoned. Trelleborg is 450 feet in diameter, with a 16-foot high rampart and a massive 57 feet wide at the base. And that was quite a rampart. I mean, I don't think digging through it would have been a very easy thing. And it had a deep ditch on the eastern side. The fort contained 16 longhouses, each some 96 feet in length, as well as several smaller houses and a square hut, and could accommodate at least 1,300 people. It is unique among the forts, however, in that it was extended beyond the circular rampart and ditch, a smaller rampart forming a sort of bailey to the east along the banks of two small rivers, and containing 14 long houses 86 feet in length, as well as a cemetery that was found to contain 135 graves, mainly those of young men, though there were a few women and children as well. To the western side of the fort there's a small berm with a ditch. Archaeological excavations indicated that the fort had come under attack at some point. Traces of fire were found, numerous arrowheads were discovered embedded in the ramparts and gates, iron axe heads and shields were also found, as well as 3 mass graves of men, many of whom showed obvious battle injuries, who'd seemingly been very hastily buried, simply thrown into the pits. Why the haste in disposing of the bodies? Why not follow the usual rituals of burial? We really have no idea, but clearly there must have been some compelling reason to forego any normal ceremonies and just dump them all into communal pits. Interestingly, an analysis of these bodies showed many of them to be Norwegians and Slavs, which suggests they were mercenaries. This could well tie in with King Harald Gormson's suggested connection to the fort, since he formed an alliance with the so-called Obotrite Slavs, a confederation of West Slavic tribes from a region that is now part of northern Germany, following his marriage to Princess Tovi of the Obotrites, making the presence of Slavic warriors understandable. Understandable that they were there, but not really understandable as to why they were all just chucked into pits. Anyway, Nonnebraken, its name meaning the Nuns' Hill, is situated on a hill near Odense on the island of Funen, and commands the Odense River, which flows beside the hill. A Benedictine nunnery had occupied the site up to the 12th century, when they moved to another site nearby, hence the name, but construction of that first building would have damaged the fort. and the fort was then severely damaged in the late 19th century when the Oddfellow Lodge, a Masonic lodge, an Oddfellow Lodge, a very odd name actually for an Oddfellow Lodge, was constructed on the site. Archaeological excavations during the 20th century showed Nonnebraken to have been some 390 feet in diameter, and traces of 3 differing sized ditches were discovered. It's a pity that so little of it remains. Bora, also known as Valo Borgring, is situated on an island, its name meaning fortress ring in Danish, and it would have commanded quite an important geographical position, dominating the old high roads to Roskilde and Ringsted, and access to the Bay of Kurga. Like Nonnebraken, little of it remains easily visible, with excavation being required to reveal its true nature. This showed it to have been some 475 feet in diameter, with ramparts 36 feet wide. 2 of the gateways were discovered exactly where they were expected to be, establishing it as the same type of fortification as the others. I mentioned the ring fort at Kurga, called Borgring, very similar in name to the previous fort we looked at, and situated near the Danish capital, Copenhagen, already, discovered only as recently as 2014. It's a fascinating site, 475 feet in diameter, but nothing of it really visible above ground until excavations began. And initially it was uncertain if it was indeed a true ring fort or not, but following the excavations, its ring structure and the crossed roadways within are clearly displayed, and people are able to either view the fort from an observation post or to go down on conducted tours and actually watch the archaeologists at work. And Welcome Centre contains objects that have been discovered. It's quite a fascinating site. Crossing now to neighbouring Sweden, we find the fortress of Trelleborg, over 367 feet in diameter. Now, a large part of this fort has been beautifully reconstructed. Wooden palisades atop the ramparts and a gatehouse, giving a superb view of what these forts must have been like when they were built. Another ring fort is thought to have been Borgby at Scania in northern Sweden, but any real evidence of it vanished under a later castle constructed on the site. There are unconfirmed possible ring fort sites elsewhere in Sweden, so perhaps we shall see more discoveries like that at Kurga. These fortresses were masterpieces of military technology, far surpassing the early Mott and Bailey castles of the later Norman period in scale, and would have proved formidable obstacles to anyone attacking them. Getting across deep ditches and then having to climb up steep embankments topped by palisades where defenders were hurling spears or shooting arrows down at one wouldn't have been a very nice experience, and it would have resulted in considerable casualties among an attacking force. The great ring forts are a fascinating and rather overlooked part of the history of the so-called Viking Age, and they show a considerable degree of skill when it came to surveying and construction methods. Their superbly and intricately constructed ramparts, considerably more impressive than those of the Normans, for example, who simply piled up compacted earth, as had the ancient Britons and the Anglo-Saxons or the Irish. They demonstrate a skill in building that isn't readily associated with the Vikings, who are usually seen as seafarers, experts at shipbuilding, yes, not builders on land. Had they used these skills more frequently outside Denmark, in England, for example, history might be rather different. A series of these mighty ring forts across the Danelaw could have given them a far greater control of northern England, perhaps enough to stave off Anglo-Saxon inroads and maintain their hold over the region, much as King Alfred the Great's formation of fortified boroughs across Wessex reduced the viability of easy Danish raids into that kingdom. That's entirely possible. To end on a very nice and constructive note, various municipal authorities in Denmark, in whose areas these forts lie, have applied to the United Nations to have them declared World Heritage Sites, with all the protections that guarantees them. I'm delighted to learn that, and it is only fitting that these magnificent structures should be given that status. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the great ring forts and other fortifications. So I shall say farewell, goodbye for now. Bye.